Hi there, I'm Cath. Welcome to my channel made by Cath Craft. Thank you very much for joining me today. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing some sewing hints and tips on a range of topics. And I thought I'd do this video because I asked a few weeks ago for some questions so I could film a Q&A type vlog answering questions about me and about sewing and that sort of thing. And I got a few questions asking about sewing tips for particular topics. So I thought I'd put together a specific video so I could share my tips on those areas. And so I'm going to cover sewing tips on in terms of cutting out fabrics, buying fabrics online, matching fabrics and patterns, and also what I do when I'm preparing to sew a new pattern. So that's all going to be in this video, and hopefully there'll be something in there that you might find a little bit useful. But first of all, before I start sharing my sewing tips, I thought I'd share what I'm wearing today. So we finally got some lovely summery weather here in the south of England, and today is set to be quite a hot day, so I thought I'd put on one of my summer dresses. And I am wearing this pattern here, which is the honeycomb dress by Crafts, and you can make a shirt or a dress. But it's a really lovely dress with some really lovely details. So yeah, it's essentially a shirt dress. It's got a little band collar and button down bodice, and then it's got sort of a panelling at the front and the back. And you make a little yoke here using the burrito technique. This was the first pattern I used the burrito technique on, and the instructions on it are really clear. And then it's got little ties here at the sides, which I think are really pretty, and cinched in the waist. And you can make long sleeve versions, as you can see here. But I've made just a sleeveless version because I wanted it to be really summery. And I've made it in this really pretty cotton poplin fabric that I got from Fabric Godmother a while back. It's got quite a large scale floral print. I'll stand up so you can see, and there's a little waist tie. But I'll put up a picture of me wearing it so you can see how it looks. I really like it because of its interesting details, and it's a nice one to sew to. And it's got a really inclusive size range. It's got a size UK 6 to UK 24 in a B cup size, and it's also got a D cup size which goes from UK 18 to UK 36. So you can buy either different category on Cocoara's website, and I'll include a link to that. But that's what I'm wearing today. It's really cool and relaxed to wear. It was a fun sew, it has pockets too. But let me now get on to sharing some of my sewing tips. So the first question I got asked is, do I have any tips for cutting out accurately? And I personally think that cutting out the fabric is such an important part of the process to make sure that the end garment hangs well and looks good. So I do spend quite a lot of time at the cutting stage. I am a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to cutting out. And one thing I really used to find annoying about ready-to-wear clothes actually is when they haven't been cut well and they're not cut on the grain. And for example, if you get a t-shirt where the seams twist round on the body or the arms, and I always used to hate ironing them as well when you couldn't quite get it to lie flat on the ironing board. So I was really pleased when I started sewing my own clothes that I could cut things just right on the grain so they do sit really nicely and the seams don't twist. But I do have a few tips for cutting out accurately that I've kind of built up as I've done more cutting and sewing. Firstly, I thought I'd mention my preference. I prefer to use scissors to cut out, and I use these ones here, which are Fiskars dressmaking scissors, and I find them really good and really sharp. I think when I started dressmaking, I had like a general all-purpose kind of crafting scissors I used, and they weren't that great, and when I got these it felt like amazing, like it was just cut through the fabric like a hot knife through butter, as it were. So I use Fiskars scissors, and then the pins, I like to pin the pattern pieces onto the fabric, and I like to use these pins here. I think they're hemline flower head pins, and they're quite nice and sharp but also quite long, so you don't have to use loads of pins to pin all the way around. But that's just my personal preference to use scissors and pins. When I am going to cut something out, I do spend quite a lot of time fussing with the fabric to make sure that all the it's all nice and flat and not twisted at all, and that the warp and weft of the fabric are nice and vertical and horizontal and don't kind of list or often I find particularly on slippery fabrics like viscose, it's very easy for the lines to kind of end up sort of drifting a little bit so that it looks nice and flat, but when you cut it, suddenly it hangs wonky. So I do spend quite a lot of time looking at the grain line, looking at the lines across and making sure it does sit really nice and flat before I put the pattern pieces on. And I do use a rotary cutter particularly for slippery viscose fabric, so I would recommend one for those, because I find sometimes with scissors, you have to kind of pick up the fabric slightly, and with the slippery fabrics, it's easy for it then to get slightly knocked out of place. So I use this rotary cutter here, which is an Alpha cutter, and I kind of read up on reviews and it generally seemed to get good reviews. So this is what I use, and I do change the blade quite regularly because it does seem to go blunt fairly quickly. So I think a sharp blade is really important too, because sometimes if the blade's a bit blunt and you don't quite cut all the fibres, and then when you try and pull the piece of fabric away, it's still attached and it can tweak the fabric out of place. So I use that, and I also have got a really big cutting mat. I've got an A1 sized one, and I find having a big cutting mat's really useful too, to make sure that you can lay the whole pattern piece out and you don't have to kind of shift it along at all, because any shifting, particularly of slippery fabrics, I think can knock it out of place. But I've got an Amazon shop actually where I list a lot of the tools I use, and I'll put a link to it down below in the description in case you fancy having a look and checking out the particular tools I do like to use. Oh, and I thought I'd mention another reason why I like to use a cutting mat and a rotary cutter instead of scissors for more slippery, delicate fabrics like viscose or tencel, is because I find that sometimes pins, if you're pinning the pattern pieces on to then cut with scissors, I find the pins can sometimes snag the fabric a little bit, so I try and treat it as gently as possible. I don't use any pins when I'm using the rotary cutter. I use pattern weights to hold the pattern piece down and then cut around the edge, so it all stays nice and flat and no snagging. And in terms of pattern weights, I made my own pattern weights actually, and they were fairly cheap to make, and here they are, so I thought I'd show you them. I've got loads of them in this little tin here. They are little metal washers that I got just from Amazon, and I've put a few of them together and then wrapped wool around them just to create these little, this was just leftover bits of wool I had, so it was quite a nice thrifty make. And so they're quite nice because they're quite small, and so I can put them in sort of small areas of the pattern, but they're also quite weighty because they're little metal washers inside. So yeah, those are the pattern weights I use to cut with a rotary cutter and a cutting mat. My next tip is particularly where you have a fabric where there's a pattern repeat or a stripe, and you want to make sure you cut it really accurately so you don't end up with wonky stripes or wonky pattern repeats, is that I find sometimes instead of cutting the pattern on the fabric on the fold, I lie it out flat. And so if, say, there's a pattern piece which is designed to be cut in the fold, I'll create a mirror image of the pattern piece, so I have the full pattern piece, and then I can put it down on the fabric and make sure that the stripe does go across all the way. Because I find particularly on slippery fabrics and jersey fabrics, it's really easy when you're folding the fabric over for it to end up being on a slight wonk, so that maybe the stripes don't go entirely accurately across. So I find cutting out on the flats and using a mirror image of the pattern piece really helps to avoid any wonkiness in terms of a repeat pattern. And I also make sure that all the notches match up as well. So if I've got stripes and there's a sleeve with a notch on each side, I'll make sure that I can see the same stripe running through the notch on both sides. And that makes it much easier then to get the stripes all accurate when you come to sewing later on down the line. And if I am cutting fabric on the fold, then I usually make sure, particularly for jersey fabrics that can easily get stretched and shifted out of place, I make sure that I check the grain line is running down the fold nice and neatly. And if there's a pattern, you can often see a pattern repeat, and make sure that pattern repeat is running down the fold nice and neatly too, to make sure that you will get a nice garment that is cut straight on the grain and not wonky at all. And also when it comes to getting things to make sure they sit directly on the grain line, say like sleeves where they're not cut in the fold so you can't line up with a fold line, is I'll pop it on the pattern and then I'll put a ruler down on the fabric further along, and then I'll measure, I've got a pattern piece here to show you actually. So you've got the grain line here on the pattern piece. I'll put a ruler down with the grain line on the fabric, and then I'll measure between the ruler and the line at different intervals to make sure that they do run parallel, because sometimes I think by eye it looks like they run quite parallel, but it actually can be slightly off the grain. So yeah, I just check on it with a ruler at different points to make sure it does sit really nice and straight. But those are a few of my tips for cutting out fabric accurately. I definitely think it's a part of the sewing process it's worth spending some time on. I also thought I'd mention that actually I don't often follow the cutting layouts in the pattern. I often just go with how I think they should sit, and sometimes I find when you do just go with your own layouts and just figure it out yourself, you can end up with more fabric left over, because pattern companies don't always use the most efficient cutting layouts, I find, on their patterns. There are some pattern companies that are really, really good at making sure that you do not have too much fabric wastage. I know Paper Theory, for example, are really good at making sure that they do minimise the fabric, but I have found with other pattern companies sometimes that you actually need a lot less fabric than they state, because you can squeeze the pattern pieces in a bit more close together when you do cut them out using your own layout. So the next question I got asked is, what are my tips for matching patterns to fabrics? And the first place I go when I'm thinking about what kind of fabric I want to use for a particular pattern is I look at the pattern envelope itself, because they usually have some details about whether it's a woven or a stretch pattern, and then what particular fabrics they would recommend. So I usually start there. But once I've had a look and seen what types of fabrics they recommend, I then have a think about what sort of effect I want to achieve with the garment. And I thought I'd use an example here, which is this pattern here, which is a sagebrush top by Friday Pattern Company, which is a woven top pattern. And it's got some really interesting features, including puff sleeves. And so depending on the type of fabric, you could create a really different garment. So I've made two versions. The first version I made in a double gauze, which is has a bit more structure and body to it. And I'll put a picture up. And when I wear that top, I can really feel the puff sleeves are really noticeable and they have volume. I also then went on to make a version in a rayon fabric, which is much more drapey and lightweight. And I'll put that top up too. And with that top, it's the puff sleeves are a lot less obvious because they really sit more drapily on me. And generally it feels a lot less structured and a lot more fluid. So yeah, it has a really different effect. So I usually think about kind of what the fabric is, how much body it has and how it will look. And I often look on Instagram for inspiration there as well, under the pattern hashtag. So I can see there how different fabrics look with different patterns, and then it can get me thinking about what kind of fabric I want to go for. I also do think about how easy the fabric will be to sew and how well I think it will match the pattern. For example, I've made the Calais shirt dress, which is quite a sort of structured shirt dress. It has a collar and a placket and lots of details like that. And when I made that, and you can make it in a variety of woven fabrics, but I've chosen a cotton fabric because it's nice and stable, and I think it'll be much more easy then to get all the little details like the collar and the placket really sharp and accurate. So that's just a personal preference there. I think I'll end up with a better garment at the end than if I made it with a viscose and end up being a bit slippery and it wouldn't end up quite as accurate or crisp. I also think about whether the pattern has stripes or checks or any pattern matching required, because I know then if I've gone for a stripe or a check, it's going to be more time in the cutting process and I need to make sure I'm extra accurate to make sure it all does match. And sometimes I just want a more straightforward sew, so I'll go for maybe a busy print where you don't have to match it, or a plain fabric. So it does depend on the overall effect I want to achieve, also how easy I think it'll be to pull it off, and if I'm in the mood for something a bit more to get my teeth into, or something a little bit more straightforward. And with fabrics, where there is a stripe or another sort of particular repeat pattern that does need to be matched, I guess there is another consideration of mine that I don't want to match it to a pattern that'll make it too tricky to match it up. So if the pattern has loads of different, say princess seams, lots of different seams going on, and there's stripes to be matched, it can be quite tricky to make sure they're matched all the way around. So I would bear that in mind as well when I'm picking a pattern. Will I be able to get it to the level where it does match nicely, bearing in mind how the pattern is cut. I did mention before that I usually start with a pattern envelope in terms of fabric recommendations for a particular pattern, but I thought I'd also mention that sometimes I don't stick to the recommendations on the pattern, and I thought I'd show you an example of this. So this is the Cocoa dress pattern, and it's designed to made in knit fabrics, and it's kind of like an A-line shaped dress, and you can also make a tunic top. But yeah, there are the line drawings here, so it's got kind of this sort of A-line structure. And it's designed to be made in medium weight knit fabrics with little stretch. So the pattern recommends Ponte di Roma double knit or interlock, so kind of more substantial knit fabrics. I'm not a big fan of Ponte for me myself because it has quite a high polyester content often, and that doesn't really agree with me. And I couldn't find any interlock that was what I wanted to use for this project, so I decided to use a cotton jersey, which is a lot lighter weight with more stretch. And the pattern doesn't recommend it. But I found I got on fine with it, and I'll put up my version here so you can see. I'm really happy with how it turned out. It doesn't perhaps have such a structured kind of A-line shape to it as the pattern intends, but I think it's fine to kind of deviate from the pattern recommendations if you're confident that, you know, the fabric you are going to use is something that you're going to be happy with at the end and it will give an effect that you want. One other thing I thought I'd mention in terms of my personal preference is if I'm using a pattern with a lot of little details and a lot of things I want to really showcase, I'd maybe go for a more understated fabric just so you can see all the little details, because I think sometimes if you have a really busy pattern and a really busy print, some of the little details can get lost. At the opposite end of the spectrum, I also find when I've got a very simple, straightforward pattern that has really clean lines and is quite, simple, I do often use that opportunity to choose a more bold, fun print to really showcase a pretty fabric and that won't get lost with the details of the pattern. But again, it's my personal preference to choose either to maybe showcase the pattern and its details or the fabric, and not both at the same time. And what I love about sewing is that everyone can express themselves differently, and so really there shouldn't be any rules around what fabric you choose, or because it's really lovely to see in the sewing community how everyone has a different preference and how a different pattern can look totally different on what fabric you choose, but equally lovely just in totally different ways. I thought I'd also mention, in terms of matching fabrics and patterns, I find Instagram a fantastic source of inspiration. If you go on the hashtag for a particular pattern, you can see all the different fabrics that have been used by different people, and I find that really helpful to see those. And also, online fabric shops can be really helpful too, because often when they list their fabrics, they provide a load of information about the fabrics, including patterns they recommend that might match really well with the fabric. So Instagram and online fabric shops are two places I often look to get some good ideas for fabric pattern matches too. So the next question I got asked is, what are my tips for ordering fabric online? And yeah, I do find this can be a trial and error process, and I think we've probably all had fabric arrive that hasn't been exactly what we expected when we've ordered it online. But I do have a few tips, because I do order most of my fabric online, particularly since the lockdown started and it's been harder to get out to shops, but also because some of my favourite businesses are online fabric shops, and even if they have a bricks and mortar shop, it's too far away for me to be able to visit it. So I really do love they have that online presence. But my first tip is to choose online fabric shops that give a lot of information about the fabrics on their websites. For example, So Me Sunshine, and I'll put a link to them below, have a lot of details for every individual fabric listed on the website, and they include loads of information, including the weight of it, the drape, how opaque it is, obviously the fabric content. And so it's really useful to have all that information so you can see if it is something that's opaque enough for what you want and that sort of thing. And then I also find, if you're not still sure what the weight means, because all the fabrics have that information on the website, you can compare to other fabrics to get an idea of how the fabric sits. For example, with a jersey fabric, you can look at the weight, compare it to another one, and see whether it's on the lighter end of the scale or the heavier end of the scale. So I find that information really useful. My second tip is, when you do buy fabrics, is to write down all the details about them so you can refer to them later once you know what it's like. For example, I've bought a couple of linen viscose blends with different percentages of linen and viscose in them, and I made a couple of pairs of shorts with them, and one had a really high linen content, and so the shorts are very structured and have a kind of that scratchy linen feel and a lot more body to them. The other pair, which had a higher viscose content, was a lot more drapey and soft. And having bought those two fabrics, and now I know what percentage each of those has of a linen and viscose, when I look again for linen and viscose in future, I'll be able to refer back to them and think, okay, this is the kind of percentage I'm looking for. This is how this fabric's going to arrive. It'll be either not drapey or drapey, depending on the percentage I go for. So keep track of fabrics you've bought, because it's all really useful research when you go to look for more fabrics. My next tip is to actually get in touch with the businesses. A lot of the online fabric shops have a wealth of information, and they're really, really helpful if you do message them, either on Instagram or by email. I've emailed smaller businesses and bigger businesses, and they're always so helpful if you have a question. And you can even ask them things like, will this fabric work for a particular garment? And they'll give their opinion. So I've done that with smaller websites like So Me Sunshine and Lamazi Fabrics, and they're always really quick to respond. And also even Minerva, which is a much bigger website. I had one example a year or two ago where I bought some teddy fabric from them to make a coat, but I didn't know what to use for the lining because the teddy fabric had a little bit of stretch to it, and I needed a lining, I guess, with a bit of stretch, but I had no idea what sort of thing to look for. So I emailed them and said, I bought this fabric from you, could you recommend some linings? And they sent back an email with a few different links to what might be suitable. And it was really helpful. I then got some swatches from them, and it helped me to choose what to use. So definitely ask the businesses. They have loads of information. They're really willing to help. On that subject too, I would recommend if it's a particularly critical fabric and you're going to spend a bit of money on it, or it's really important, it's just right. A lot of the websites also have swatch services, so you can get a few swatches to check the fabrics. So it can be a little bit of an expense up front to order those swatches, but I find it's worth that little bit of an expense up front to avoid ordering a larger, more expensive amount of fabric that you aren't necessarily going to find right for your purpose. So recently I made the Oslo coat by Tessuti, and I did a vlog where I talked all about that coat. And in that vlog I also shared the swatches I got, because I really wasn't familiar with coating fabrics, and I knew that a wool coating can come out really differently depending on the particular fabric. So I ordered about 8 or so swatches from Minerva of the different coating fabrics, and it was amazing how different they all were. And I talk all about those swatches in that vlog if you fancy checking it out. But anyway, it was really useful having got those swatches, because it really helped me narrow down what I wanted. And I think if I hadn't got them and I'd just chosen a fabric, it might have ended up not what I wanted, and I'd had a huge amount of fabric that wouldn't have worked for the coat I wanted to make. So I definitely recommend using swatch services, and I think a lot of the businesses, bigger and smaller ones online, do offer that service. I thought I'd also mention, in terms of buying fabric online, I have a really handy tool that I find really useful in terms of getting matching threads for fabrics, which I think can be quite hard to often do online. And it's this tool here, which is called a Gutermann Mara, and they can be hard to get hold of, but it is possible. I think my husband got this one for me for Christmas, and it was a bit tricky to get hold of, but he did find one. But inside it's got all the Gutermann sew all thread colours in here. And so it's really handy when you've got a fabric to be able to hold it up and get a true match to a thread. So I find that really useful. But I thought I would also mention, in terms of thread matching, a lot of the websites I do find have an option to add a matching thread to. I know Minerva do, Sew Me Sunshine, Guthrie Ghani, and a few of the other online websites. So when you're buying fabric, it's also worth seeing if that's an option that you can add a matching thread, and I'll match it for you to make sure you do have the right thread for the project. The final question I got asked is, what are my tips for what do I do when I'm preparing to sew a new pattern? In terms of research, whether I look on Instagram, blog posts, YouTube, what do I do when I'm gearing up to sew a new pattern? And after I've read the pattern envelope, usually my first stop is Instagram, and I usually search the pattern hashtag and spend a bit of time looking on there. And I find it a really helpful source of inspiration and information. And so I'll look at what fabrics people have used and how they look, and the different effects that are achieved by different fabrics. I'll also look at hacks people have done, in case that gives a bit of inspiration for hacks I might want to do. And I'll look at how the pattern looks on different body types and what might suit me. And often, if they're I'm particularly interested in, I'll click on them and have a read of what the person who's posted the picture has written about it. For example, what size of the pattern they used and any adjustments they needed to make, because that can be really useful to find out. And also what the fabric was they used. So I love it on Instagram when people post quite detailed information with their pictures, because I find that really useful for research, particularly when you're going up to sew a new pattern. As well as Instagram, I often do Google for blog posts on a particular pattern, because I find that often blog posts can contain more detailed information, particular adjustments and sizing and any particular tricky bits of the pattern that could be really useful to know before you get started. An example of this is I made the Stylark Ariana woven sundress. And it's a really lovely sundress, but Stylark's pattern instructions, I think, are on the minimal side, and they don't hold your hand through as much as some of the other pattern companies. So when I got the pattern, I thought, oh gosh, there isn't a great deal of information here. So I went off and had a look, and I found an amazing blog post written by a lady called Sewing Like Mad, and I'll include it below in case you're interested in that dress. Had loads of detail about the dress, and it really helped me through the sewing process, and I don't think my dress would have turned out as well if I hadn't read that blog post and used it in conjunction with the pattern instructions. So I'd really recommend blog posts. And one reason I started up my own blog actually is because I thought I found other people's blog posts really useful. I really wanted to be able to, I guess, give a little back and to just give my perspective on patterns and put information out there that I would find useful to see in a blog post on a particular pattern. So yeah, I really enjoy putting in details of adjustments I've made, because I think hopefully someone out there might find that quite useful. So yeah, I look at blog posts. I don't generally look on YouTube for research for a new pattern. I think I tend to go to YouTube to enjoy hearing other people chat about their projects. And I do love seeing how patterns have turned out. And I might look at YouTube for a particular tutorial, but I wouldn't generally look at YouTube for pattern research. I think I kind of want to go through the whole pattern research a bit more quickly, so I wouldn't necessarily sit and watch a 15-20 minute vlog on a pattern review. I think I just want to get started a bit more quickly than that. I also thought I'd mention a couple of other steps I do in my preparation process before I sew a new pattern. I am a big pattern tracer, so I always trace out every pattern because I really like to tweak the patterns quite a lot, and I want to make sure that I have my original version there always to go back to in case I want to kind of reverse the tweaks or do a different kind of hack or anything like that. So I always trace the pattern pieces and then make the alterations to my traced versions. And I thought I'd mention what tracing paper I use, because I've been asked that a couple of times before. I use this tracing paper here, which is Burda tracing paper, and I get that on Amazon, and I'll make sure that's linked to my Amazon shop in case you want to check it out. But yeah, so I always trace patterns. I also spend a bit of time often with a new pattern comparing the pattern pieces to existing patterns I have. For example, for a new woven dress pattern, I'd look at where the bodice sits compared to my other patterns, so that I can get an idea up front of any alterations I need to make. For example, if the bodice looked like it was going to come up too short, I'd add a bit of length on. And again with the sleeves, if I'm making something long sleeved, I compare it to a sleeve length that I've used successfully on another pattern, just so I can already add that fabric on and avoid ending up with something that's going to be too short when I've got information that would suggest it needs to be lengthened. So I do spend a bit of time fiddling with the patterns before I go ahead and make them. And I feel like that stage sometimes helps me avoid having to make a toile every time for a new garment, because I do spend that time sort of, yeah, having a think about it and thinking how it's going to fit me up front before I go ahead and make it. So I think that pretty much concludes my sewing tips vlog. I really hope you found a few tips in there that might be helpful. It's been a bit of a head scratcher trying to think of my tips, so I hope I've included some good ones, and I hope you've enjoyed the vlog. And if you have enjoyed the vlog, I'd love it if you give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, I would really love it if you would press the subscribe button and also the bell icon so you are notified of my future vlogs. If you have any really great tips on those subjects, I'd love to hear them too, and I'm sure other people would love to hear them in the comments too, so please do share them. Thank you so much for watching again. I'll be back with another vlog soon, but in the meantime, I hope you have a great day, and thanks again for watching. Bye!